Well, it's with great pleasure that we're gathered together with two of my favorite people in the Senate. Uh, Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard, who I have the pleasure to co-host this, and Senator Dan Christmas, who I once remember, Dan, you giving me great advice as I showed up there, a complete newbie. I didn't even know where the restrooms were. You said, Stan, just take your time, work hard, try to struggle to understand this, and one day it'll all make sense to you. And I said, how long did that take you? And you said, about 2.5 years. so here we are. I'm closing in on that time right now. But it's a delight to have the Honorable Dan Christmas on this broadcast. He's an independent senator for Nova Scotia, the first Mi'kmaq senator to be appointed to the Senate of Canada. He served in various leadership positions in the Mi'kmaq Nation of Nova Scotia, was actively involved in the recognition and implementation of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights in this province. He's been active in a number of international, national, provincial, and local agencies in a wide range of fields, including Aboriginal and treaty rights, justice, policing, education, healthcare, human rights, adult training, business development, and the environment. And so it's so great to have you here with us on this really important issue of Indigenous nations, peoples, and races. I'm going to start off with the first question. Although the conversation about anti-Indigenous racism has been happening in Canada for some time now, many people are still confused about what it might look like. Can you share with us your understanding of what anti-Indigenous racism looks like and how the legacy of colonialism may affect Indigenous peoples today?
Well, thank you, Stan, and it's great to be here both with you and Wanda. It's a real privilege and an honor. Anti-Indigenous racism, we don't have to look very far here in Canada to see it. I know we can just look at the education system, for instance, look at the high school graduation rates, for instance. The Canadian average is around 85%. The average among First Nation students is roughly half of that. It's around 43%. You could look at childcare. I think I find childcare is probably the one field I find most disturbing. Back in 2016, Census Canada reported that roughly 52% of the children who are in care in Canada are Indigenous, which is astounding when you consider that children under 15, meaning Indigenous children under 15, make up only 7.7% of the population of Canada. And then you have 52.2% of the children in foster homes and in other care facilities. It's amazing. But the last number is probably most telling. The federal correctional system reported, I think 40 years ago, that 25% of the federal inmates in Canada are Indigenous. And I thought it was a shock back then. And more recently, 4 years later, we find that number has risen to 30%. So 1/3 of the inmates in Canada are Indigenous when our population is only about 5%. For Indigenous women, it's even worse. Indigenous women, 42% of the inmates in Canada are Indigenous women. I find that numbers astounding. And so if you just take a look at the cold, hard stats or facts that we have available to us, it's pretty clear that anti-Indigenous racism exists in Canada. And it's very disturbing. And you can go to other fields. I don't mean to single out the correctional system or the social work system or the educational system, but you could take a look at the healthcare system, for instance. Just recently, former Justice Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond did a study in British Columbia, and she found a disappointing level of racism against Indigenous people in the British Columbia healthcare system. And of course, we could talk of other instances. We could talk, for instance, of recently there was a report out of Quebec about an Indigenous lady who, Joyce Etchikin, who on her deathbed had recorded some disturbing racial comments made to her as she was dying by healthcare officials. So it's not just one part of society; it's all throughout. And for most part, I don't think people are intentionally racist or intentionally discriminate, because most of these sectors are led by professionals, be it teachers, be it lawyers, be it judges, be it correctional officers, be it social workers, healthcare workers. I mean, these are professionals in Canada who serve these fields. And I often think about, for instance, how a number of people, even today, still believe that the Indian residential school system was a good thing, that it did good things. But you only have to look at the results to see that it was horrendous. It was cultural genocide here in Canada. So how people can say the residential school system was good when the result was so disastrous, it sort of speaks to me that, there's a lot of well-intentioned people in these systems, but we all know where good intentions take us. So that's what is disturbing. That's what we've come to know as a systemic racism.
You've highlighted so well so many of the systemic racism issues that are so deeply embedded into all of our systems that it makes it really challenging, I think, for a lot of folks to figure out where to start. And one of the things I really like about what you said at the beginning was you really highlighted that school to prison pipeline and also the child welfare to prison pipeline, which we know are still very much in force. Last week, we had Senator Lillian Dick, and she mentioned the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and noted that provincial and federal governments should make real commitments to resolving the issues outlined in the TRC. So I'd like to ask, what's holding us back, and what immediate actions could the federal government take to work towards real reconciliation in Canada and address these systemic racism, systemic anti-Indigenous racism issues that you've summarized so well for us?
I listened to Senator Dick's comments, and I was very inspired by what she had to say. One of my idols, I don't mind saying to you, is Senator Murray Sinclair. And but when I first got appointed to the Senate, he was the first phone call I received to congratulate me. And I didn't know Senator Sinclair very well. I didn't know him at all. And I'm so pleased for him. And as we all know, he'll be retiring. One of his famous quotes is that education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. So I think the key message out of the TRC was that we have to begin to focus on educating Canadians about the truth of our history here in Canada, as unpleasant as it is about Indigenous people. But we also have to begin the process of becoming aware and understanding enough to begin to see where the gaps are between our relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So that is a very, very long road. I remember a few years ago, I'm trying to remember the exact year, I think it was 2019, there was an Angus Reid poll who asked Canadians how much they understood about Indigenous issues in Canada. And the poll said that roughly 2/3 of those polled in Canada had little or no understanding about Indigenous issues. That leaves only 1/3 that had some or half decent understanding. So the reality is that here in Canada, across all of our populations, that we just don't know very much about Indigenous peoples and about Indigenous issues. 2 out of 3 really don't have an understanding. So I think the emphasis needs to be on education, both in the public school system, in the post-secondary school systems, but also public education as well. And I think it's that part that disturbs me the most, because schools and universities are catching up quickly. I hear of high schools and secondary schools have Mi'kmaq courses here that are open to any student. I know of universities that do a lot of Indigenous studies. But when you look at the general population, I mean, how many institutions out there are doing just popular education about these issues? And I know here in Nova Scotia, we have 2 public policy institutions, the McCachran Institute at Dalhousie and the Mulrooney Institute in St. FX. And I don't know if they've done any public education about Indigenous issues or done any research on Indigenous issues. So there's a huge need, I think, for public education. So when I go back to your question about what federal and provincial governments can do, I think one of them is to begin investing not only in schools and post-secondary institutions about Indigenous issues, but look at supporting and creating public policy forums that can educate the ordinary Canadian about the issues in their areas. I think that's critical. That's vitally, vitally important. And I hope, within the next 10 years, we begin to see those changes. I'm hopeful that out of the public school system and universities, we're developing a new generation of young people who have a fresh approach about dealing with Indigenous issues. But I still won't worry about the older population, the ones that are in the workforce now and will have to struggle and get by with very little knowledge or information about the issues that they're faced with.
Dan, you really hit a chord with me on that one. And one to know is that my previous background, way before medicine, was in history, Canadian history, and not only was Black history very poorly or not taught, Aboriginal First Nations history was poorly or not or hardly ever taught. So I'm completely with you on that. But I got to raise something here, maybe a little bit difficult for us, but we're all senators. And I just wonder, why don't we show our colleagues that, there are good programs out there. University of Alberta has one. You can go online and you can take and you can learn a lot about Indigenous peoples, and there are other programs. I know Senator Francis has put together a reading list. And I read it. I found it very, very useful. We should maybe challenge our colleagues to show Canadians. We can lead by example. Why don't we show Canadians? Why don't we say, okay, who of our colleagues are going to take a challenge that we're going to actually educate ourselves about the Black history, about Indigenous history? Think about that, because we have to show people too, right?
Oh no, I fully agree with you, Stan, and as you know, there's quite a few senators who have a lot of experience in teaching. I'm glad you mentioned Senator Brian Francis from PEI, because I was speaking to him last week, and he was telling me that his group in the Senate are thinking of doing some education courses within their own caucus about Indigenous issues. And it dawned on me, this is 5 years now since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And what has Parliament done about education its own members, be it the House of Commons? There's 338 what have we done over the past 5 years to take the initiative to create programs to educate ourselves? And as you know, among the Senate, there's a number of Indigenous senators that could assist and help. So you're right, Stan. I mean, we only have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves why. Why haven't we done more? But even beyond that, you look at the whole federal and provincial and municipal forms of government. You know, one of the key calls to action under the TRC was call to action number 57, which recommended that all these levels of government educate and train its public servants on critical areas of Indigenous life, be it history. There's a need for more history of understanding of what happened in the country of Métis and Inuit and First Nations. There's a need for understanding international law, the upcoming UNDRA. Understand Aboriginal and treaty rights. How many Nova Scotians know that there's 3 treaties here in Nova Scotia? 1725-26, the 1752, and the 1760-61, which Donald Marshall Jr.'s case was built on. And we don't understand Indigenous law. Lately, there's been a lot of talk of Nadugalim when it comes to fishery. People don't understand what Nadugalim means. And of course, we can talk about the whole Crown Indigenous history, the relationship that's happened over the last 2 or 3 centuries. I mean, there's so much to learn. And I've asked that question. I mean, why hasn't Parliament, why hasn't the senior public service taken the initiative to take Call to Action 57 and bring it to life? Now, the public educator for the public service is the Canada School of Public Service. I've asked them that question. They're doing some courses now, but I've often asked, well, shouldn't you lead by example, and shouldn't you require deputy ministers and ADMs and some of those to take the course first? And then I'm sure when they take the course, others will say, well, if our DM did it, then I should do it. So yes, we have a long way to go on that one, Stan, I'm afraid. And I have to look myself in the mirror as well. And I have to say, well, I have to do my part as well. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Part of what we're doing with this series on the pandemic of racism is actually having these difficult conversations. And so I'm really happy that you raised that as well, because as leaders, we have to hold ourselves accountable. As leaders, we really must lead by example. And so we need to ask those questions about what's happening at the federal level, and also what's happening with the public services, what's happening with employment equity, where are we missing the mark, and what do we do about it? But I want to pick up on one other tidbit that you touched on, Dan, in terms of laws and fisheries. And, of course, as 3 Nova Scotian senators, we're very aware of the current, the recent violence and racism against the Mi'kmaq fishers, and how that reflects the broader themes of colonialism, of racism, and the systemic violence. What structural barriers do you think stand in the way of solving and resolving those issues? And what should we be doing to move forward collectively?
Mm-hmm. Well, the structural barriers are pretty easy to identify. In a colonialism setting, it's obvious that you have one culture, the European descendants who arrived here in Nova Scotia in what we called Unama'ki and Mi'kma'ki, Cape Breton and all of Atlantic. And they arrived with the assumption that this was their territory. They based their justification on a couple of, one law called Doctrine of Discovery, another called Terra Nullius. And it just basically means that they assumed that this land was empty and that it was there for their taking and for their exclusive control and for their exclusive use. And that's what colonialism is. It just basically pushes away what was there already, what was already thriving, living, and being part of that land and those waters, and just to discard them and to throw them away as disposable, and when they began to decline, to not even try to allow them to survive. Fortunately, the Mi'kmaq did survive. I remember one account in the mid 1800s by a former Indian Affairs Commissioner, Joseph Howe, and he basically predicted, he went through the province, looked at the state of the Mi'kmaq, and he basically said there was only 1,100 Mi'kmaq left in this province from an estimated population of 20 to 30,000. And he said, we shouldn't have any problems. This population will go extinct. But we didn't, and we're still here. So what do we do now? Well, the solution was actually arrived at the time of settlement. When the European settlers first arrived, yes, there was a fight over land, there was a fight over resources, there was a fight over settlements. And unfortunately, there was a war. And many, many settlers lost their lives, and many, many Mi'kmaq warriors had lost their lives. But fortunately, there was some wisdom in the air. And they signed these treaties. And they were not land cession treaties. Mi'kmaq didn't surrender their lands and waters. That's pretty clear. It's pretty obvious. What it was all about was peace and friendship, about how these two cultures, and at the time the dominant culture was the Mi'kmaq, the European culture was a smaller one. But the Mi'kmaq agreed that we would share our lands and resources so that we can prosper together on this land. So that was the solution back in the days of the treaties. That's what it was all about. And I think we need to go back to that, to get rid of this old doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and really look at the foundation of the settlement of Nova Scotia, which is the treaties of 1725 and 26 and 52 and 1661. And these are the treaties that the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized. The 1752 treaty was recognized in 1985. And of course, the treaties of 1760 and 61 were recognized in the Supreme Court of Canada in the Marshall case in 1999. So these are not new decisions. So the treaties are valid. And I say that's the pathway to creating peace, friendship, reconciliation, and resetting the relationship that was initially the way that we thought how this province would live side by side with its populations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And for me, in my journey of trying to understand this, I have to tell you that it took me a while to realize that that's what the treaty said. And I think that a lot of people are like me, that they don't know that. It comes back to your education piece. But it's not just education. I think there's also I am firmly committed to enhancing the personal relationships. Mm-hmm. People who come from different backgrounds. Like there's nothing quite like having a friend or someone you've fallen in love with who's from a different background than you are, to open your eyes wider. And I know you've spoken about that a number of times and very eloquently.
Well, I come from Membertou, and Membertou is a rags to riches story. About 25 years ago, we were pretty well bankrupt. Today is probably one of the most economically successful First Nations in the country. It was part of that coalition, for instance, that bought Clearwater Fine Foods. But we in Membertou, I'd say 95% of our customers are non-Indigenous. And so we didn't do any cross-cultural education courses, and we didn't do any of the education part. What really worked for us was simply inviting our neighbors to our community, to come to our restaurants, to come to our hotels, to our bowling alleys, to our hockey rink, to our cultural center, come to our powwow, come to our retail shops. And people came. And the whole attitude between Membertou and the broader city of Sydney changed dramatically. And it was because there was relationships. people were seeing each other, saying hi to each other, serving each other. They were talking to each other. And of course, that's growing in Nova Scotia. We have a number of retail operations opening. You can look at Buckenkeg that recently opened a service center. You can look at Millbrook. You can look at Gluskap. You can look at a number of communities. But the other way, Stan, is a lot simpler. I remember taking my kids to the hockey rink and the ski hills and the baseball field, and of course you're standing there with other parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and you're standing there for quite a while. And so if you're in the hockey rink, you're freezing.
You got that right.
I've done my time in the rink, but you know what? I got to know other parents. I got to know other grandparents, and you see them every week. You get to know them. You get to laugh and joke and talk. And you know what? Some of those relationships still are great today. Whenever I bump into someone I met in the rink, we can sit and chat and have a great conversation about our kids and about what we're doing. And some of these parents, their other roles in life sometimes may be very prominent. And so you get to develop a good relationship with people from different walks of life. And I've often heard the comment, especially from non-Indigenous people, that they were so grateful when they met Mi'kmaq people and got to know them and how their lives were enriched and enhanced. And I could say the same thing. I could say the same. There's a lot of non-Indigenous people I've met over the years, and I've treasured those friendships. So it's not just taking courses. It's all about simple things like sharing a cup of coffee at a freezing hockey rink or at a baseball field. It's something simple as that can make all the difference, and it's all about relationships. That's what it is.
So I think Dan, we've often, and you and I have often talked about Member 2 and your economic development at Member 2 being certainly nationally recognized for the positive economic development you've done there. But it seems like you're also saying that Member 2 could be an example for what you call the resetting the relationship and refocusing on peace and friendship. So going beyond the treaties, going beyond the systemic barriers that keep us apart, and really looking at, so what are the things that bind us? What are the things that unite us? What are the ways that we can work together to do something differently? And that reminds me, actually, you and I were both appointed to the Senate on the same day.
The same day, yes.
And there was such excitement right across the province. But one of the most exciting announcements that I heard was actually from the host of our information morning at the time was Don Connolly. Mm. He referenced the two of us, and he talked about the two of us being inspired appointments to the Senate of Canada. But part of what I was thinking about at that time was how our communities, African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq communities, how we've worked together over the years and have worked in solidarity. I wonder if you could talk just a bit about what that Indigenous African solidarity might look like on a wider scale.
Oh, you're definitely right, Wanda, about that, because the history of Indigenous people and African Nova Scotians goes way back. And that relationship predates even some of the later settlements that arrived in Nova Scotia. But as early peoples here, we face a common struggle. We still face a dominant culture that still believes that it's the one and only thing that works right in Nova Scotia, which isn't true. Because once we begin to look at what things work well for Indigenous people and what things work well for African Nova Scotians, quite often they're very different from what the dominant culture sees. So we share that common bond. So I think we should continue talking and sharing our experiences, what works, what doesn't work. And I think that would help a great deal.
And finding ways to work more together and more in collaboration and as stronger allies.
Definitely, yes, I agree.
This time has gone far too quickly. I want to thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and the insights that you've shared. I want to thank all of the viewers who have tuned in and those who will watch us on the link later. And I want to just let folks know that next week our topic will be anti-Black racism, and our guests will be Natalie Dome and Counselor Lindell Smith from Halifax. So we thank you.
Thank you very much, Wanda and Stan. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Dan. Thank you, Wanda.
Thanks, Dan.
All the best.
Bye-bye.